When we hear the word psychopath, many people immediately imagine a dangerous criminal, a serial killer, or someone who is completely incapable of feeling anything. But the reality is much more complicated. Psychopathy is often associated with a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, manipulation, and antisocial behavior. However, not every person with psychopathic traits is a murderer or a violent criminal. In fact, some people with these traits may live relatively ordinary lives, have successful careers, maintain relationships, and even appear completely normal to the people around them. So, what actually happens inside the mind of a psychopath? How do they think about other people? Why can some of them hurt others without experiencing the same guilt or emotional pain that most people would feel? And perhaps the most interesting question is this: if someone understands that an action is morally wrong, but does not emotionally feel the suffering of another person, are they still morally responsible for what they do? To understand these questions, we first need to understand what psychopathy actually means. Most people naturally experience emotional reactions when they see another person suffering. If we see someone crying, we may feel sadness. If we see someone being seriously injured, we may feel fear or discomfort. And if we hurt someone, we may experience guilt or regret afterward. These emotional reactions are closely connected to empathy and our understanding of right and wrong. People with strong psychopathic traits, however, may experience these reactions very differently. They can understand what another person is feeling on an intellectual level, but they may not experience the same emotional response themselves. This distinction is extremely important. A psychopath may look at a person who is crying and understand, this person is sad. They know what sadness looks like. They may even know exactly what words to say to make that person feel better. But understanding an emotion and actually sharing that emotion are not necessarily the same thing. This is one of the reasons manipulation can become such an important part of psychopathic behavior. A person who understands human emotions without being strongly affected by them may learn how to use those emotions to influence other people. They can lie convincingly, they can imitate emotions, they can appear charming and confident, and sometimes they can make other people trust them very quickly. This does not mean that every charming or manipulative person is a psychopath. But these characteristics are often discussed when describing psychopathic traits. It is also important to clarify what we mean by the word psychopath. Psychopathy is not, by itself, a formal psychiatric diagnosis in the same way that conditions such as depression or schizophrenia are. Instead, it is generally understood as a pattern of personality traits and behaviors. These traits can include a lack of empathy or remorse, superficial charm, manipulation, emotional shallowness, impulsivity in some individuals, and persistent antisocial behavior. Psychopathy is also closely related to, but not identical to, antisocial personality disorder, which is a recognized psychiatric diagnosis. The important point is that psychopathy exists on a spectrum. Not every person who displays one or two of these characteristics should be considered a psychopath. A person may be emotionally distant without being psychopathic. Someone may lie frequently without being a psychopath. And someone who breaks the law does not automatically have psychopathic traits. The overall pattern of behavior and personality is what matters. One of the most fascinating aspects of psychopathy is that a person does not necessarily look dangerous. In fact, they may look completely ordinary. They may be intelligent, they may be well educated, they may have a successful career, they may have friends, a partner, or even a family. They can participate in conversations, make jokes, smile, and behave appropriately in social situations. This is possible partly because psychopathic traits do not necessarily prevent someone from understanding social rules. A person may know exactly how society expects them to behave. They may understand that lying is considered wrong. They may understand that hurting someone is considered wrong. They may even understand that other people expect them to feel guilty afterward. But knowing the rules and emotionally caring about the rules are two different things. This can make certain individuals extremely difficult to recognize. They may learn how to imitate the emotional reactions expected from them. They may smile when they are supposed to smile. They may express sympathy when sympathy is expected. They may apologize when an apology is socially necessary. But behind that behavior, their internal emotional experience may be very different. This ability to understand social expectations while remaining emotionally detached can contribute to manipulation. Another common misconception is that every psychopath is a violent criminal. That is simply not true. Psychopathy is strongly associated with antisocial behavior and is more common in criminal populations than in the general population, but psychopathic traits do not automatically lead to murder or serious violence. Only a minority of people with significant psychopathic traits become violent offenders. This distinction is important because popular culture often treats the words psychopath and serial killer as if they were synonyms. They are not. A person can display psychopathic characteristics without ever committing murder. One of the more noticeable characteristics can instead be their emotional response to situations that would normally produce fear, sadness, anxiety, or guilt. Imagine two people witnessing the same traumatic event. One person might become frightened, emotionally overwhelmed, or deeply disturbed by what they saw. Another person might remain unusually calm and emotionally detached. That emotional difference alone does not prove psychopathy. However, when emotional detachment is combined with other traits such as manipulation, lack of remorse, shallow emotions, and persistent antisocial behavior, it becomes much more significant. Perhaps the most interesting question is whether psychopaths are completely incapable of empathy. The answer may be more complicated than simply saying yes or no. Research into psychopathy has suggested differences in the way certain brain systems process emotional information, particularly information related to fear, punishment, emotional learning, and the distress of other people. This may help explain why some individuals with strong psychopathic traits do not respond emotionally to other people's suffering in the same way most people do. But there is an important distinction between two different forms of empathy. The first is emotional empathy. This is the experience of emotionally sharing or responding to another person's feelings. The second is cognitive empathy. This is the ability to understand what another person is thinking or feeling. A person can have relatively strong cognitive empathy while having weak emotional empathy. In other words, they may know exactly what you are feeling without actually feeling it themselves. And that ability can be used in two very different ways. It can be used positively, such as understanding people and communicating effectively, but it can also be used negatively, such as manipulating someone's emotions. Some research has suggested that people with psychopathic traits may be capable of demonstrating empathic responses under certain circumstances when they are specifically instructed to focus on another person's perspective. If that is the case, it raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps the problem is not always that they completely lack the ability to understand another person's emotions. Instead, they may not automatically or spontaneously respond to those emotions in the way most people do. And that difference is extremely important when we talk about morality. Another common question is, what is the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? The two terms are often used interchangeably in popular culture, but they are not exactly the same concept. Generally speaking, psychopathy is often associated with more calculated, controlled, and emotionally detached behavior. A person with strong psychopathic traits may carefully plan their actions and understand how to manipulate social situations. They may appear calm and controlled. Sociopathy, on the other hand, is often used to describe antisocial behavior that is more strongly influenced by environmental factors and emotional instability. A sociopathic person may be more impulsive. They may have difficulty controlling their anger. They may become involved in fights, theft, or other criminal behavior without carefully planning every step. Their relationships can also be unstable. Psychopathy and sociopathy are not two perfectly separated categories. Human behavior is much more complicated than a simple psychological label. Now we reach one of the most interesting parts of this topic. What happens when certain psychopathic traits exist in an environment where aggression and violence are not necessarily required? The answer can sometimes be seen in the corporate world. Traits such as confidence, fearlessness, emotional control, competitiveness, charm, and the ability to make difficult decisions can sometimes be useful in business. A person who does not become easily frightened may be willing to take risks. A person who remains calm under pressure may be able to make difficult decisions. And someone who understands how to influence other people may become a powerful negotiator. The problem begins when these characteristics are combined with manipulation, dishonesty, exploitation, and a complete lack of concern for other people. This is where the idea of the corporate psychopath comes from. Such an individual may rise through an organization because they appear confident, ambitious, charismatic, and highly capable. But behind that appearance, they may manipulate colleagues, take credit for other people's work, lie to protect themselves, or sacrifice other people for their own success. This demonstrates something important. A personality trait is not automatically good or evil. Fearlessness can help someone become a great leader, but fearlessness combined with a lack of conscience can also make someone dangerous. Confidence can inspire people, but confidence combined with manipulation can become exploitation. The same characteristic can have very different consequences depending on how it is used. Of course, our understanding of psychopathy has also been heavily influenced by movies, television, literature, and anime. Some of the most famous examples come from real criminals such as Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. These cases have contributed to the popular image of the psychopath as a violent and terrifying killer. Fiction has taken this idea even further. Characters such as Hannibal Lecter and Patrick Bateman have become famous representations of psychopathy in popular culture, and for anime fans, there are even more interesting examples. Johann Liebert from Monster is one of the most famous examples. Johann is particularly interesting because his character does not rely simply on physical violence. Instead, his intelligence, manipulation, psychological influence, and ability to understand other people make him frightening. Another example is Shogo Makishima from Psychopath. Makishima is particularly interesting because his character raises questions about morality, free will, society, and the meaning of justice. These fictional characters are obviously not scientific representations of real psychopathy. Writers often exaggerate psychological traits to create more dramatic and memorable characters, but they can still be useful for exploring philosophical questions, and that brings us to the final and perhaps deepest question of all. If a person does not experience empathy or guilt in the same way that most people do, should we judge them differently? Philosophers have approached questions like this from very different perspectives. Immanuel Kant, for example, emphasized the importance of treating human beings as ends in themselves rather than simply using them as tools. From a Kantian perspective, manipulating another person purely for personal benefit would be morally problematic because it treats that person as a means rather than as an individual with their own value. This creates an interesting problem when thinking about psychopathy. A person may understand the rule intellectually while failing to experience the emotional motivation behind it. But does that remove their responsibility? Jean-Paul Sartre approached morality through the idea of freedom and personal responsibility. From this perspective, human beings are responsible for the choices they make. This raises another difficult question. If someone understands that their actions will harm another person and chooses to do it anyway, can they still be held responsible even if they do not emotionally experience guilt? And then there is John Stuart Mill and the idea of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism focuses on consequences. An action is morally valuable when it produces greater overall well-being and reduces suffering. From this perspective, the internal emotional state of the person committing the action may be less important than the consequences of what they actually do. A person may feel no guilt after harming someone, but the suffering caused to the victim still exists, and this leads us to a fascinating conclusion. Morality may not depend entirely on what we feel. It can also depend on what we understand, what we choose, and what consequences our actions create. Psychopathy is much more complicated than the image of a cold-blooded killer that we often see in movies. It involves a complex combination of personality traits, emotional differences, social behavior, and, in some cases, antisocial behavior. Not every psychopath is a criminal. Not every criminal is a psychopath, and not every person who lacks empathy is dangerous. One of the most fascinating aspects of psychopathy is the possibility that someone can understand another person's emotions without experiencing those emotions in the same way. They may know that someone is suffering, they may understand why that person is suffering, but they may not feel the same emotional response themselves. That difference can make manipulation easier, but it can also raise important questions about responsibility and morality. Perhaps the most disturbing part is not simply the idea that someone might lack empathy. It is the possibility that a person can understand morality perfectly well while choosing not to follow it. And perhaps that is why psychopathy continues to fascinate us. It forces us to look at something we normally take for granted, our conscience. We assume that knowing someone is suffering should make us care. We assume that hurting someone should make us feel guilty. We assume that fear, empathy, and remorse naturally guide our decisions. But what happens when those emotional signals are weak or absent? Where does morality come from then? Is morality something we feel? Is it something we understand? Or is it something we consciously choose? The question of psychopathy ultimately becomes more than a question about people who are different from us. It becomes a question about ourselves. Because by trying to understand the mind of someone who seems to lack empathy, we are also forced to examine why empathy, conscience, and moral responsibility are so important to human society. So what do you think about it? Stay curious. Until next time.